You probably think you are pretty tough for surviving a weekend hangover, clutching your overpriced electrolyte water, complaining to your friends that you feel like you are actively dying. But if you were dropped into the 14th century, you actually would be dying. And not from the bubonic plague, but because you wouldn't know how to hydrate yourself without catching dysentery. There is a pervasive, incredibly arrogant modern myth that people in the Middle Ages walked around perpetually hammered because the drinking water was toxic. That is entirely wrong. They were peasants, not idiots. They knew that drinking water from a stagnant ditch would turn their digestive tract into a slip and slide. They drank water from fresh springs and deep wells all the time. But water does not have calories. And when your daily fitness routine consists of pushing a wooden plow through frozen mud for 14 hours, you need liquid fuel. So they drank ale. But before you start romanticizing this era as some endless, joyous medieval frat party, let me burst your bubble. Stick around, because in a few minutes we are going to look at why medieval toddlers started drinking early and what witches had to do with all that. Let us get the menu straight first. What you drank dictated exactly how long you were going to live. If you were nobility, you drank wine. It was a status symbol, imported, expensive, and served in ornate goblets to show everyone that your bloodline was supposedly superior. And forget about mead. Mead is honey wine. It is astronomically expensive to produce, and unless you were a Viking chieftain or a wealthy lord with a massive surplus of bees, you were not drinking it. If you were a peasant, which is what 99% of us would have been, you drank ale. But this was not your crisp, perfectly carbonated modern IPA. Medieval ale was an opaque, uncarbonated, murky soup. It was brewed from grain, water, and yeast, and it had the consistency of a protein shake made by someone who deeply resents you. It was also highly perishable, meaning you had to drink it fast before it turned into sour, alcoholic porridge. If you wanted the good stuff, you went to the monks. Monks were the Silicon Valley tech bros of medieval brewing. They had the time, the literacy, and the infrastructure to perfect the craft. And they had a massive incentive, thanks to a brilliant little theological loophole. The Catholic Church mandated strict fasting days, which could take up almost half the year. But the golden rule was, liquida non frangunt jejunium. Liquid does not break the fast. To survive weeks of starvation, these holy men brewed beer so thick and nutrient-dense, it was essentially liquid bread. They were spiritually fasting while chemically carbo-loading. The church did not just drink the alcohol, they weaponized it for crowdfunding. Enter the church ale. Imagine a modern school bake sale, but instead of dry brownies, the parish brews massive vats of strong ale, and the congregation is socially pressured to buy and drink it until they cannot see straight, or to fund repairs for the church roof, or to support the local poor. It was pious, mandatory binge drinking for community infrastructure. But brewing was also an economic war zone. Before hops became the gold standard, brewers flavored and preserved their ale with something called grut. Grut was a proprietary, highly guarded mixture of herbs like yarrow, mugwort, and occasionally things that were mildly toxic or hallucinogenic. And guess who held the monopoly on selling grut? The local lords and the church. It was a mandatory tax. You had to buy their weird botanical wheat mix to legally brew your ale. Then, hops came along. Hops were a technological revolution. They acted as a natural preservative, meaning beer could be stored and transported, and more importantly, they were a wheat that nobody could tax. Yet. The introduction of hops sparked an absolute panic. The church literally declared hops to be Protestant, unholy, and disruptive to the social order, which is the medieval equivalent of a taxi cartel trying to ban Uber. They did not hate the hops, they hated losing their spice monopoly. Despite all this liquid carbohydrate intake, the Middle Ages was not a lawless booze fest. If you got visibly drunk, started a tavern brawl, or passed out in the street, you did not get a polite warning from a bouncer. You were thrown into the pillory. You were locked in wooden stocks in the town square, while your neighbors threw rotten vegetables, animal entrails, and literal feces at your face. It was the ultimate public cancellation, designed to make sure you never skipped a day of labor because of a hangover again. There was, however, one type of alcohol that you absolutely did not drink for fun. Aqua vitae, the water of life. Distilled spirits. In the Middle Ages, hard liquor was not a beverage, it was cutting-edge alchemy. It was produced in tiny quantities by apothecaries and used to clean wounds or dissolve medicinal herbs. Nobody was doing shots of medieval vodka on a Tuesday. That is, until the Black Death arrived. When a bubonic plague wipes out a third of the population and your doctor's best advice is to wear a bird mask stuffed with dried flowers, you stop caring about medical guidelines. People started drinking aqua vitae, pure, straight from the apothecary's flask, in a desperate, burning attempt to numb the terror of an apocalyptic pandemic. Hard liquor became a consumer good simply because reality became completely unbearable. Which brings us to the daily reality of the medieval household and the promise I made you earlier. How did children survive, and why are you dressing up as a 16th century brewmaster for Halloween? Water, as we established, was safe if drawn from a good source, but it gave you zero energy to survive the freezing winters. So everyone, including pregnant women, the elderly, and literal toddlers, drank what was called small beer. When you brew beer, the first run of the mash extracts the most sugars, making a strong alcohol. But you do not throw that expensive grain away. You wash it through with water again and again. This final, weak extraction creates small beer. It had an alcohol content of maybe 1%. It was not enough to intoxicate a child, but it was boiled, it was sanitary, and it was packed with calories. It was the medieval equivalent of a sugary juice box, just with a hint of ethanol to take the edge off teething. Kids drank it for breakfast because it was sterile survival juice. And who was brewing all this household ale? Women, specifically the alewives. Brewing was considered a domestic chore, like baking bread or weaving. But some women were exceptionally good at it, and they started selling their surplus to make an independent living. To advertise that a fresh batch of ale was ready, an alewife would hang a broom over her door. To keep the mice out of her precious grain sacks, she kept a cat, usually a very well-fed one. When she went to the chaotic, crowded medieval marketplace to sell her ale, she needed to stand out above the crowd, so she wore a tall, pointed hat. A woman standing near a broom, accompanied by a cat, wearing a pointed hat, brewing bubbling concoctions in a giant cauldron. Sound familiar? When the brewing industry shifted from a household chore to a highly profitable commercial enterprise, men realized they were missing out on the money. To push these independent female entrepreneurs out of the lucrative market, May-dominated guilds launched aggressive smear campaigns. They accused the alewives of cheating customers, watering down their product, dealing with the devil, and brewing unholy mixtures. The independent businesswoman was systematically rebranded into the Wicked Witch. Your favorite spooky Halloween icon is literally just the victim of a corporate smear campaign designed to steal a beer monopoly. The medieval relationship with alcohol was never about seeking a thrill. It was an absolute biological necessity wrapped in a deeply cynical economic game. They drank to survive the cold, the starvation, and the grueling reality of an era where a bad harvest meant a slow death. The next time you sip a perfectly chilled craft beer in a climate-controlled room, remember that you are drinking the luxury equivalent of a medieval peasant's desperate survival ration. Cheers.